Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Today we're diving into a topic that affects more people than you might realise: romance scams. My guest is Anna Rowe, a teacher turned advocate who has made it her mission to fight back against this insidious form of emotional fraud. Anna was deceived for over a year by someone leading a double life. And on this episode, she'll share her story of uncovering the truth, the emotional toll it took on her, and why she's now fighting to change the laws. We'll explore the manipulation tactics used by scammers and why it's so important that victims speak out. We'll also talk about how online platforms make it easier for predators to operate and what we can all do to protect ourselves and others. So whether you're curious about the psychology behind scams, think it's something that could never happen to you, or just want to understand why our legal systems are falling short, this incredible conversation will leave you with some valuable insights. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Anna Rowe on romance scams. Welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Christian. It's great to be here.
I'm thrilled because you and I have spoken on the platform together before, and I just thought you were a super interesting person doing a really, really interesting and important thing. And so I'm delighted that you're here to talk about it. But to start us off, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and how you came to do what it is you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got this quite down pat to be more succinct now after doing this for so many years. But it was back in August 2015. It's a lot of years ago now. I know. But it feels still like it was yesterday. That's how, it stays with you. And we'll talk more about that. But I was second time round using dating apps, actually. And I'd had a really good relationship that had been 2.5 years from someone that I'd met online. And it was a year later after that had ended, but not in a bad way. And I was just like, okay, it worked for me before, let's try again. And as a single mum who doesn't have a lot of time or a lot of money to go out on, dates all over the place, and as someone, and this comes into kind of the thing that you do really, those different human behaviours, I'm very much the sort of person, I get attached to people really, really quickly. The opposite almost of attachment disorder. I get attached really quickly, and not just in romantic situations, but with friends. I become loyal to people very, very quickly and will fight their corner, whatever. I don't often have a connection romantically, but when I do, I fall hard and I fall fast, but it's quite rare. So for me, being able to talk to people online, keep that distance for a while, just to see if there is anything there. If you spend a little while talking with people, you then start to realise, don't you, whether there is any longevity in a good conversation, that kind of stuff. So it's great for me. And I'm a real advocate for online dating. So when this profile came along, and it was the wording on the profile, and this is really important for what I do now, it was the wording on the profile that really attracted me more than the picture. So it was talking about someone that was humble, grounded. The most bit of it was that he hated poor communication and mind games. So it was that kind of thing, loyal, genuine. And I was like, oh, wow, it sounds like he's been hurt before and he won't do that to me. So I swiped on it. And then the next morning it came up, you've got a match. And he'd messaged, hi, Anna, it's Anthony. Let me start. Where are you based? And we talked online for 3 months, just like my other successful relationship from online, before we then finally met in person. And it was one of those relationships you hear about where it seemed to be that soulmate connection that everyone dreams of. It was incredibly intense after that sort of connection had been made. So within that final month, it was incredibly intense. And even before we'd met in person, when I read back over my messages, I'd said to him, it scares me how close I feel to you already. So I was aware that this was a crazy sort of intense relationship. And then it carried on from there. I wouldn't have known at the time all of the stages that I'd been put through, because it's not something that I'd ever, learnt about or needed to know about before. But the side of it was, or the end of the story was, that 14 months later, after being through this absolute emotional roller coaster, was that this guy wasn't even who he said he was. So I discovered that he'd been leading more than a double life with a complete fake identity. So he had a complete fake online identity that he was living offline under, fake emails, Skype accounts, full sets of social media, and a phone number that was dedicated to this fake life. And he's a lawyer here in the UK. And at that time, unbeknown to me, in a very, very prominent organisation as their director of legal services. So, yeah, and when I tracked, because I ended up tracking him down into his real life and finding out who he really was, obviously, because I am that kind of person. But yeah, he was also married and had been for 16 years. So it was, for me, part of the grooming that I'd been through in that process. He knew that for me, people that cheated were the lowest of the low, and that I would never, ever have been the other woman in a relationship. And the upside of it was that I went public with my story because the police didn't want to know. I was given proof. I'm not someone that will just jump on, oh, well, perhaps. I was given proof that that phone he was using was dedicated to his fake life under his fake identity. And it was then that I knew that there were other victims, because on WhatsApp, for example, he was constantly online and had always said to me, oh, it's the kids or it's my parents, because he worked away from home a lot, which he did. But I then knew that that had been other women the whole time. So all the time I saw him online, it was other women and not his family. So I knew there were other victims, but I didn't know who or how many. So it was at that point that I went to the police, and they didn't want to know. And I was saying, look, this guy, in the process of me tracking him down, I'd realised he was using these dating apps as a sweet shop, a hunting ground for victims. I worked that out. I worked out very quickly how to match with him very, very easily when I was trying to draw out who he was. And they just weren't interested. So I went public with my story, started a petition to campaign for getting this kind of thing more firmly put in legislation. It was kind of split in the legal sphere, because half of the lawyers that I spoke to were saying, well, actually, this should already be covered under legislation, because under consent legislation, actually, the amount of information and misinformation that you were given to consent to being in an intimate relationship means that you weren't actually in a position where you could give informed or genuine consent. So half of them were saying it's already covered, and other people were saying, oh, none of this is covered at all, and it wouldn't ever be. And I'm like, so I started a petition to clarify or make it illegal. And other women started coming forward, and I'm currently up to 17 that I know of.
Wow.
Yeah. It took me 2 years to get the police to finally take a look. And part of the reason they did eventually, after I'd done SAR requests and got very badly redacted documents come back from the police, and they'd left a top man's mobile phone number in the emails. So I phoned it, and fair play to him. He was amazing. And he said to me, if you've had to go to all this trouble, there's reason for it. And he booked me 2 hours out of his day to go and actually tell him the real story of the little tiny paragraph he'd been emailed. And he was horrified. He was absolutely horrified. And he said to me at that point, and there were only, I think there were 14 of us at that point. He said the likelihood is that if that many have come forward, there's probably 100 or more victims in reality. But included in those victims were 2 women very early on who'd been aggressively raped, and another sexual assault. Even though the police were aware of that, they still hadn't bothered to say that they would investigate. And that's why it had been, so awful. So they did investigate. It took 3 years. COVID hit in the middle of all that. Goodness knows how much more. There were 5 arrest attempts. The 5th time they got him to bring him in. They put through, finally, a 8 to 9 victim case to CPS, including those 2 aggressive rapes, the sexual assault, and then the handful of contentious sex by deception cases, which included mine. And CPS turned around and said that it didn't reach their evidence threshold with that many women and all of those rapes.
Wow.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it? And we wonder why still, despite all of the things that come out from police, these new initiatives and stuff about we will protect women and girls, and there's been a huge rape, it's called Satera, I think from memory, where police forces have had rolled out to them how they're supposed to treat rape victims and all this kind of thing, and still CPS, do that. It becomes almost impossible, and it's no wonder we've got such low convictions, isn't it? So it was off the back of that I set up my website, really. I was in a real mess because this kind of manipulation that goes on in those relationships really screws with your brain. It really screws with your brain. And I'm not the kind of person that is easily taken in. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I've always been hyper aware of the tiniest little things that don't add up, if you like. And I was always that person that my entire life where friends or family would come to me and say, what do you think about that person? Because the vibes I would get were 100% right all the time. And that's how good he was, that he got under my skin like that. And so it threw me for 6. And I went to see a counsellor because I could not understand why this man, even after I'd ended it all, had this hold over me. And she said to me, you need to do some research on narcissists and psychopaths. And I did. And that was my eye-opener. And then I started recognising these stages that I'd been put through. So the grooming process early on, he'd opened up first about his supposed awful history, and that had given me trust to open up about myself. And of course, then that is all used later throughout the relationship. And then came the love bombing, where for someone, people always say to me, oh, that's rubbish. Look at you. You're all confident and la, la, la. And I'm like, no, that's just the mask I put on to show people. My whole life, I've never had a great amount of self-worth or self-confidence. Just, that's just who it is and how I am. And I've learned to deal with it over the years. But when you've got someone that is that clever and that subtle and that manipulative, he was the first person ever in my life to give me a little bit of self-confidence about myself, which made it all the more damaging to know that was built on lies at the end. And then you've got all this trauma bonding that goes on. Very, very clever when you've had that amazing, intense relationship built and you've been centered as the most important person in their life. You feel needed and wanted, and then they will disappear and you've got that feeling it's suddenly gone because you've done something wrong. And that creates a trauma bond. And then, of course, you've got something awful happening to them. And in this instance, much like you'll hear in normal romance fraud that people know about, the financial kind, he stood here, this 6-foot guy, stood here with tears in his eyes, telling me that his mum had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and he was in absolute bits. And I was devastated for him, and all of this would have been awful if any of it was true. But I discovered afterwards that he didn't even talk to his mum. There'd been a huge rift in the family many years ago, and he didn't even talk to his mum. And his mum's perfectly healthy and she's fine. He told one of the victims she died. So the same kind of tactics were used here, as I then later saw with other victims in what we would call financial romance fraud. So with all this information that I'd gained, I wanted to put it somewhere because although there were websites about narcissists and psychopaths and sociopaths and all that kind of thing, there wasn't anything in relation to my sort of case where it was built through a double, someone leading a double life in a fake identity. So came up with the name Catch the Catfish, started putting all this information about what had happened to me. And almost immediately, also because I was doing lots of radio and press, I started getting lots and lots of emails from people who'd been in a similar situation to me. And it was horrible to read just how much of it there was out there. It was crazy. But then amongst those emails, there started to be people where it was clear that the intent was a financial intent behind it. And I'd not ever heard of catfishing before what happened to me. But I could see that there was something different in the intent. But the text messages that these victims were sending me were absolutely paralleled to the kind of text messages that I'd received. I could see that process, that grooming, that love bombing, that trauma bonding. So I had immediate understanding and empathy of the manipulation they'd been put through. So I was at that point, okay, I can still help out here, not just in a supportive way. I'd learned from my experience how to do a reverse search. So I was then putting these photographs that they had through. I was finding the real people because I am a bit stubborn like that and I will keep going till I find them. So I then was like, okay, there's got to be more to this. This is clearly something really big. It's not a one-off because I was getting more and more emails coming. So I started to go and look for where these people were, who they were. And I am that kind of person. If I don't know about something, I will go and research it to death. So I then very quickly found out that these people were called Yahoo Boys, that there were these groups on Facebook where they were training each other and they were trading all the tools that they used and stuff like that. And I was collecting all this information. And of course, COVID had come up at this point. And so we had the lockdowns. I was on furlough from teaching for some of it. And I thought to myself, okay, look, I am a teacher. I'm really good at collecting information, putting it in an accessible way for people to learn. I should be able to do that with this information I'm seeing in these groups to warn other people as well as being there for support. So that's when I started all my pages across social media, and they have just organically grown from there. So I'd been doing that for 5 years. And then while that investigation was going on, I wasn't allowed to do any press because the police were doing all their stuff. But once it had been handed to CPS, I said, enough's enough. I'm not keeping quiet anymore. And I was being asked to do a webinar. So I went and did that for SASIG. And it was there that Cecilia saw me, Cecilia from the Tinder Swindler. So she was also on that call, but not talking at that point. And she'd heard me. And then we had a gala dinner off of the back of that webinar. And she was there. And that's where we met for the first time. And she'd wanted to be doing something after her experience. I was looking to further what I was doing to go into doing some training and things like that, because the experience I was having from victims, pretty much like my own, was that if they were brave enough to go to the police, it was almost more traumatic than the actual experience itself, because the police didn't have a clue what was going on. So my next step was, can I help the police to understand more what's going on with these victims, how they could better speak to them to help prevent more trauma, etc. So Cecilia then said the next week, after we met up for lunch, shall we work together rather than doing two separate organisations? And that's how Love Said was born. So Love Said kind of has become an umbrella organisation, if you like, for all stakeholders of romance fraud. And Catch the Catfish, as it stands as quite a solid thing in its own right now, sort of sits under that umbrella as the public-facing victim support and education pages. So yeah, it's been a big journey, but that's kind of who I am. I have to take something negative and turn it into a positive, so that the nasty ones don't win.
So many questions and emotional moments that I want to explore. But if we go back to the point at which you discovered that all was not what it initially seemed, what sort of things were you, and I guess I'm asking one because I'm just curious as to what alerted you, but secondly, obviously, so that people who are listening to this, who may find themselves, can think about what are things that might tip one off? What was it that gave you the sense that all wasn't what it seemed?
Yeah, so that was, I had 3 months of grooming. It was very much set in chunks, if you like. I had 3 months of grooming where it was all online. I had then 6 months to the day where he was coming here regularly, a couple of times a week. And then it was I'd actually got quite poorly, and I'd got a lung infection, like early pneumonia, and I'd actually cracked a rib, and I was really poorly. And it was our 6-month anniversary of meeting each other in person, and he'd been here that night and then said goodbye in the morning, and that he'd see me that night because he was due to come back. And then he phoned in the day and said to me that he'd started feeling poorly as well, so he was gonna stay up in London. And I was a bit relieved because I was absolutely exhausted. But I had no idea at that point that was the last time that I was ever going to see him. And time went on, and then Brexit happened. So, like, a couple of weeks had passed. He'd obviously, he'd already told me about his mum, and he'd said at that point that his mum's health had taken a turn for the worse. And then Brexit happened. And in the field of work that he worked in, because he'd told me that he worked in the legal sphere for aviation, and he did, just not whereabouts in the sort of food chain that he worked doing that, or which organisation it was. And it was actually me that said to him, don't stress out about driving to see me, because it was a good hour and 20 minutes drive from London to get to me. And I'd sort of said to him, just don't stress out. As long as you're letting me know you're okay, I'd rather you keep your health for your boys and your mum and dad. And so I'd actually given him permission. But this is what happens in these kinds of situations. They give you the power. So that's why you think it's okay, because they give you the power. And time went on, and we were still chatting all the time. But I was always getting the messages about, oh, I miss you, blah, 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 blah. And then throughout that final 5 months, it turned out to be, I was just getting on with things. I didn't want it to end, but there were times when I tested him to say, do you want us to continue, or would it be easier if we left things for now so you didn't have to worry about me as well? And 5 times I did that. I went back and counted. And every time he would absolutely flip on me and say, please don't leave me. I can't do this without you. It's just a difficult time we're going through, blah, 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 blah. So he kept me. He absolutely kept that control over me the whole time. But as the months had gone on, and because he wasn't actually present in my life, that hold had started to dwindle a little bit, or he wasn't in my ear, if you like he had been so cleverly, where, you know, I know now it literally felt like he was reading my mind. I could be thinking I was going to say something to him, and before I got the chance, he would put that worry to bed by saying something, and I hadn't even voiced it. He was so clever in that respect. But he wasn't there to do that. So those little vibes, you know, that bad gut instinct that you get that something's not quite right, I was starting to listen to it because he wasn't there to quash it. And it got to a point in the October. So it was May was the last time I saw him. May the 6th, I think it was. Not awful, I can still remember the date. And I think it was the 6th or 7th of October that it was quite late one night, and I was just getting this awful sense. And I thought, I'm going to go back online and see if he's online. And because I'd been lied to before, I'd been cheated on before. So and any time I'd felt that paranoia before, I pushed it away and blamed myself and said, this is just you trying to sabotage a relationship because of what happened before. You're being paranoid. Don't listen to it. But I was listening to it now. And so I set my profile up again. But because it automatically put my picture on it, I swapped my picture out for a stock image online. And but everything else was me. It had my name, it had my location, it had my age. And I put in the same filters, if you like, for how far the age that I was looking for. And within 20 swipes, this profile came up that I recognised as being him. Same picture. And the profile underneath had changed very slightly, but not a lot. But the age was a year up because we'd gone in a year down the line. And I screenshotted it, and I WhatsApped him because he'd said he was away in Germany at that point. And I said, I need to talk to you. And he went, what is it? Tell me. And I said, I'm not doing this over text. You need to call me. And we went on, and he was saying, darling, what is it? You're worrying me. Is it your health? Is it your parents? And I was like, I'm not doing this over text. You need to phone me. And he said, I'm coming away from the table, because he'd said he was with clients in the restaurant. I'm coming away from the table. I'll call. So he phoned, and I sent through the pictures of this profile. And he went, I don't understand. What is this? I deleted my profile when we got together. And fortunately for him, not so much for me. Again, literally a week or so before, I'd read this article where people were getting caught out because they thought that if they deleted the app from their phone, that it deleted their profile on the platform, but it doesn't. So at that point, in my head, I was giving him the benefit of the doubt. And I said, okay, whatever. But, I hope that's really all it is. And I then came away, but he went radio silent, which was very unlike him, completely radio silent. And so 2 nights later, I woke the app up again, because I deleted it off of my phone, but I put it back. And as it sprung into life, it went ping, you've got a match. And I was like, what the hell? I've not been on here. And little did I realise that when I'd come across his profile, I'd swiped it and I hadn't realised. And it sprung up, you've got a match, and it was this profile. And then it went ping, you've got a message. And I opened the messages and it went, hi Anna, it's Anthony. Let me start, where are you based? And it was exactly the same scripted conversation as the one that had been sent to me 14 months before. But it became very apparent, obviously, that even though it was my name, my location and my age on it, he hadn't realised that it was me. And he then started chatting to me, and I continued the conversation with him believing it was someone else. So it was 10 o'clock at night at that point. And something was very different in that when I had had the conversation with him 14 months before, it was much slower. Now it had ramped up and it was much more, he was pushing a lot more. And he said to me, even within that first hour, have you got a WhatsApp number? Give me your number and we'll chat tomorrow. And it had been like, I think 3 or 4 weeks before we exchanged numbers before. And I didn't have one to give him. So I was like, oh, I'm too tired now. Let me think about it. Maybe tomorrow. So then I went down to my parents, and my dad, who's in his 80s and doesn't use WhatsApp, I said, can I borrow your phone? And I set up WhatsApp on there and I sent him that number. So then that night, I sat there when I'd got home from work with 2 phones on my lap, mine and my dad's, and I talked to him through both at the same time. And he was, the conversation had gone from being someone who appeared to be just this really kind, humble, gentle, thoughtful, considerate guy. This was sleazy. He was sending voice messages that were really provocative, and it made my skin crawl. It made me feel sick because it wasn't the person that I'd recognised from knowing for the last 14 months. And it got to the point where he asked for another photograph and I didn't have one. So, because it was just a stock image. And so I then sent him it's quite a popular meme that says, it's something like, if liars were paid, I know someone that'd be a millionaire. And I sent him that and pictures of me.
Right.
That chat. And he just turned around and he went, I knew it was you. And he didn't. There's no way he knew me. He said, I knew it was you. And he just said bye and sent me kisses. And that was it. He blocked me. And I thought that was it. And I then remember, you won't know yet, but it was it was a couple of days after that that things started getting deeper. I started understanding that it was worse than I thought, basically. So my initial thoughts were that I'd been had again by a player. But something again, and I'd really started listening to my inner gut. Something again was really niggling me. And I started trying to do a bit more research. And I'm very good with details. I remember details. I've got a memory like an elephant, and it really, really pisses some people off because I can go back years and pull up conversations in my brain like a video. And so I was thinking of all this stuff he told me, and I was putting it into the internet thinking, like, okay, so he said he worked in legal. I know he didn't give me a company per se, because it wasn't of interest to me, but he's got to be registered, right? If he's in legal somewhere. So I started looking on all the registers. There was nothing. I'm also a family historian. So I'd gone back with all the information that he'd given me, looking up on the BMD, couldn't find a birth or anything on there. And I was like, shit, what is going on? This bloke literally doesn't exist. And then I put the photograph. Remember, I'd only just got it back again. I'd got the photo that he'd used on that dating profile. And we'd laughed about it, saying, because it was a really old photograph. It was obvious it was old. And, but we thought, I said, that's got to be 10, 15 years old, that photograph. But I wasn't that bothered about it because it was the words on the profile that had attracted me more than anything. And I ran it through a search, and it came back as a Bollywood actor called Saif Ali Khan. And it was just a guy. It was a black and white photograph of a bloke wearing a suit. And he'd said to me, oh, it was a corporate picture from like years and years ago. And I really hate having my photograph taken, so I just used that. And I'd seen tons of pictures of the real him before we'd met in person, but it was really cleverly chosen, like down to the dimple in his chin.
So it's close enough.
It was close enough to say, all right, so he's put on a little bit of weight, his hair's a bit grayer, but he could get away with it, kind of thing. And I'm a bit of a chameleon in photos. I look really different in different photos as well, depending on what angle you catch me at. And he did. All of his real photographs, he looks very different in all of them. And I was just like, what the hell is going on? So knowing that he'd blocked me on WhatsApp, I didn't know whether he'd blocked me on his whole phone. So I texted and I went, Saif Ali Khan, Big Bear, because that's what I used to call him, Big Bear, because he was this huge guy. And he texted back and he went, you knew? And I went, I knew what? And he went, you knew? And I said, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about. Who are you? And I'd started reading up the history of Saif Ali Khan, and some of the stuff that he'd used that he told me about his childhood was very similar to all of this. And so I then realised that this guy obviously wasn't who he'd said he was, and none of his real photos came up on any searches at all. So over the next 6 weeks, like a friend had said to me, he's been in your house on his own. How do you know that he's not like gone through your stuff and that you're going to end up with a bloody loan taken out on your mortgage or whatever? And I was a bit worried about that. So I then thought, I've got to find who he is. And I started matching with him with the help of some friends. We'd set up these other profiles on the dating apps and we kept matching with him. And I matched with him 6 times over the next 6 weeks. And every time I was trying to draw out this information from him, little bits and pieces. And I also started tracking the location, how far he was from my address, because on certain apps it tells you. So I was plotting in a diary. How far is he in the day? How far is he at night? How far is he at the weekends? And a pattern emerged very quickly. So in the daytime, he was like 72 kilometres from my house in the week. At the weekends, he was 335 kilometres from my house. But the nights were really random. So I then remembered that he told me, like on the phone, oh, I'm just going through the Blackwall Tunnel on my way home from work, to come and see me. So the signal might cut out. So all of these little bits of information that he told me from time to time was starting to come back. And he had said that they had offices in Canary Wharf, but that he also had offices in other places in the country and in Europe as well, because Lufthansa and EasyJet, that the company he worked with them as well. So I was putting all this information together I put a radius tool of 72 kilometres from my address on a map, and it came up that actually cut through like where Canary Wharf and that was. So it was one cold November night, it was 6 weeks later. I said to a friend, I'm going up there. I'm going to drive that way up to Blackwall Tunnel. And as we got into the Blackwall Tunnel, we just approached it. There was a sign. I don't know if you know it. There's a sign for an airport there. And I looked at that airport and I went, that's where he is. That's the one airport he had never mentioned to me. And knowing the rest of the reverse psychology that had been going on, I said, that's it. And we went. And it's tiny, that airport, isn't it? Really tiny. So we drove in to the tiny open stay, short stay car park, went through the barrier, came back round, and in front of me was this car, not the car he used to drive here in, but a car with a number plate that was just one digit different. And it was a semi-private plate. And I like, the brakes went on the car, obviously. As I'm like, are you seeing what I'm seeing? That can't be a coincidence, can it? And it was a BMW, not an old Peugeot that used to drive here. And we went round and I parked up behind it. There was a row of cars in front of me. Within 5 minutes, down the step from the big office block, he walked down the steps. And I hadn't seen him for 6 months at that point, remember? And my friend that was with me said he could hear my heart banging on the other side of the car. And he got out and went up the steps, asked him for a light because he was smoking, which he'd given up when he was with me. And he then followed him back up into the building, and it's a big double-sided office building. And he went up the lift over to the left. And my friend looked on the wall and it told you on the 3 levels of the building who worked on which level. And sure enough, it said on the top level that the legal services worked. And I then saw him appear in the top window. And I then recognised the backdrop to some of the photographs that I'd been sent, with the bookshelf here and the blind behind, because he used to sit with his back to the window and take selfies. And my friend came out and he said it's the legal services that are on the top floor. So we typed in that particular airport and legal services on LinkedIn, and up popped this profile. There was no picture, but a name. And I looked at it and I went, that's him, look at that name. And it was the first name that I knew had been lengthened, and the last name on that profile had been shortened. So it was a variation of his real name. And we then typed that name into the internet, and up came one black and white corporate picture of him. That was it on the internet. And it was a black and white corporate picture. I could see it was him. And that's how I found out who he was. So for the next 10 weeks, I went off and used all of my skills as a family historian to do lots of OSINT investigation. And I think by the end of it, I sort of knew more about him than he did, because I am a bit like that. I found out who he was. There was only 9 people in the country with that surname, so it made it a lot easier to find. And it was then that I found out that he'd been married for 16 years and still was. But that, he'd fed me the story, as they do when they're grooming, and of everything they want you to know, that he'd said he'd been divorced for 15 months, was just starting out on the dating scene. But he'd said that the arrangement he had with his ex-wife, because he worked away all week, which he did, was that he used to have his boys at the weekend with his parents, and he was Indian. And that's quite common in Indian families, And so the truth of it was that he actually lived with his wife and her family in a huge house with his 3 boys. And his mum and dad, he never talked to, because there'd been this huge rift in the family when his youngest was very young. I could work all that out from the census records. How crazy is that? Because they used to live until the child was 2. And then they'd moved in with her family, which for Indian families is quite unusual because they normally stay with their husband's, family. He was the eldest son. And so I could work it all out from just the records that were open online. And because I'd been asking to meet up with him ever since I'd realised he wasn't the same person. He wasn't the real person. And he'd always refused. But I then sent him a text message with his real name. And I had a meeting within 10 minutes. Agreement to a meeting within 10 minutes at that point. And I was the first person, it turned out, that had ever discovered who he really was. But he fed me a load of bull, as pathological liars do. When we went and met, there wasn't anything I could believe other than the stuff I already knew the truth of because I'd got it. And then I handed him over that package of information, and someone said to me, "Well, what did you ask him? Did you want to stay with him?" And I was like, I didn't want anything to do with him, but it didn't take away that feeling of love that I had. You can't just turn that off. And I just begged him not to do it to anyone else because I was very fortunate that I had my kids and I had a good support network around me to talk to. But I had wanted, when I was driving to work, for the lorries on the motorway to take my car off the road. It was that horrible. And I didn't want him getting hold of someone that didn't have a support network, that he'd have ended up with a suicide on his hands and someone would end up dead. You can see it still makes me emotional now to talk about it.
Wow.
But yeah, it's something that never leaves you. You learn to live with it, but it never leaves.
What really strikes me here is that your commitment, passion to finding out the truth. I mean, you have gone, like you've got skills that allow you to do it, but even with those, you've really gone for this, right? This is you're not letting this lie. And I'm struck by that lots of other people wouldn't have the time, the wherewithal, the commitment, the courage to do what you did. What was it that prompted you to do that? Was it anger? Was it curiosity? Because it's not, take this the right way, it's not a natural reaction. Because lots of people would go, this is horrible, but you really, you weren't going to let this go. And I'm fascinated by what it was that drove you to do that. Because in a way, his expectation would be that nobody would ever dare do that. You've built this carefully elaborate scheme, and I'm going to get away with this because what you did to him is never going to happen.
Yeah. No, and that's why I always say that things happen for a reason. And I think out of all of his victims, I was probably one that hurt the most because I was the one that was with him for the longest period of time. And I am that kind of person. Like I said at the beginning, I fall hard and I fall fast. And when you realise that someone, whether it's my kind of romance fraud where money wasn't involved, whether it was Cecilia's where she met him in person and there was money involved, or where it's just the online ones, the manipulation is the same. And when you come out the other end, it's like, I call it with the victims when we do support, a triple trauma. So not only are you trying, any ending of a relationship is hideous, but these kinds of relationships are something else. And they are so deep and intense that when it suddenly ends, the void you're left with is crazy. And then to discover that that person didn't even exist is something, again, that person never actually existed. That was a character that was created just for you. It was shaped around who you are because they're mirroring back all the qualities that you hold dear. And to have your emotions that expertly manipulated by someone, you never trust yourself again. You can trust other people, but you don't trust yourself to see that again in someone else. It's really hard. And the police asked me the same question, Christian, when I did an interview, because remember, it was November I found out about him and I didn't report to the police until it was the day after my birthday, actually, in January, because that's when I'd been given the proof about there being other victims. And they said to me, well, it's really hideous what happened to you. Why didn't you report it straight away? And I said, because I wasn't important enough to report it when it was just me. So the whole time I thought it was just me, I didn't feel it was important enough. I wasn't important enough to do it. But the second I knew there were other victims, that's always been what's driven me. So when I knew there were others and I could not bear the thought of other people being put through the feelings I was going through. So I wanted to try and stop it. And that was my motivation for carrying on. And then, of course, when I started getting all the emails from other people that had similar experiences with other people, for me, it's really overwhelming. But when you're then being told, thank you for being our voice because we couldn't do this, that again for me, because I am that sort of person that needs to be needed and I love helping people, that was my motivation. It was like, I've got to keep going because there isn't anyone else that's going to stand up and say this for them and we need to stop it. So that was my motivation. And other people have always been my motivation. So, but it's also really supportive because you know you're not alone when you've got that kind of army around you, if you like. So yeah, that's why.
And you mentioned there are other scams where money is involved.
Mm.
The bit I'm struggling with thinking about it is the money ones I can sort of see because you get something out of it. This is purely for there's obviously physical kicks if you want to put it that way, but this is just because you can, right? Is that what's driving this? There's perverse pleasure in getting away with it.
I think it started off the way that I saw his behaviour evolve over time. I think it very much started off as a sexual thing because he would do this whole grooming bit. And then early on, the first couple of victims that he had, it was the second he had them on their own, there was aggressive rape. But then that was it for him. It was get out, don't want to see you, don't ever darken my doorstep again. I don't want to hear from you again. And all of that hard work got him one night.
Mm-hmm.
By the time he got to me, he'd slowed things down a lot, but that gave him longevity. And I think, I mean, I'm not in his head, but I'm making assumptions, but these assumptions make sense.
Yeah.
In that I think he got as much of a kick out of the control he had over us through the deceit. Also emboldened by the fact that he'd got away with it for 12 years. You know, by the time it was 12 years he'd been doing it. So I think the combination of, I think there was definitely a sexual motive there. Absolutely, he got a kick out of creating this control through the relationship. I also think as a narcissist, you know, when you delve into their personality type, they need that constant ego feeding. So by creating these, because there were 5 of us over the time that I was with him, you know, as well as his poor wife up in Leeds. But the work that he did gave him the perfect opportunity because for 5 nights a week, he was working down in London and the family was all the way at the top of the M1 corridor. They were up in Leeds. So it was the perfect opportunity to lead this double life where nobody knew what he was doing. And I think for him, because they say that most narcissists are very, very insecure people in themselves. So to have that constant ego boost from that honeymoon period in a new relationship where someone's, you know, besotted with you, if you like, that's great for them, isn't it? Not so great for us.
And so the way you're talking clearly and your campaign and the work that you do is demonstrated this is not an isolated thing, right? This is happening on I hesitate to say massive scale, but certainly a very, very big scale, right? There were lots of people that are out there. And I'm assuming the more you sort of were diving into this and looking at it, it was becoming apparent to you this was not an isolated case, that this is happening. This is a function. We could call it a societal problem. We could say it's caused by the apps. It's a male problem. It's just there as a thing. And so this is in a way, with this, we have structures in society and technology and acceptances of behaviours that are facilitating this.
And a broken judicial system where you've got a lawyer who knows full well that anything on that front is highly unlikely to ever be investigated or prosecuted. They see it, don't they? It's flashed all over the news. 1.6% of rape cases, only 15% reported. These figures are flashed all over the news. What are the chances?
So what you're doing in your work is, one, you don't want anybody else to fall for this, but secondly, you want to make sure that we have a judicial system that handles this and recognises this for the crime that it is.
Absolutely. Why should the consent legislation be restricted to someone? I think people forget, and I don't even like calling it rape because I somehow feel like it belittles people that have been through very, very violent, aggressive rape. But the truth of the matter is that rape revolves around consent, and that comes on a spectrum. So legally, it should fall under rape, although I would rather it have the label of sex by deception, because that used to be part of legislation until they updated it. And then it seemed to disappear and get brushed under the umbrella of consent. But it's then never been tried under the new legislation, and so it's almost vanished. So there are lots and lots of cases out there, the landmark cases, I suppose you would call it, that have bits of it in each of the different cases. There are cases where some judges have said in their summing up that consent cannot be vitiated by lying about money, for example, lying about wealth. So if some guy said, I'm a millionaire, and that woman slept with him because he was a millionaire, but it was a lie, that wouldn't vitiate consent. But he said, one of the judges, I can't remember which judge it was, but he said everything else should be taken in a broadly common sense approach. And there's another judge then that said that marriage shouldn't vitiate consent, because I think they think it would open the floodgates to people that were having affairs then being drawn into. But for me, I don't think that's right. I mean, wealth is a materialistic kind of thing. Marriage, unless you're aware that you're in an affair with someone, I don't particularly think that should vitiate consent. But his lies were almost threefold. So he not only lied about his identity, who he was, he also lied about being married. But the worst of it was that he lied about his intent for us, as in his victims. He had told us that he wanted, it was very apparent on his profile, a long-term serious relationship. That's what he was looking for. He sold the background of not having had, because of his culture, for example, that there were never lots of girlfriends. It was very much, that's how their culture worked, that it was serious relationships. And for me, that's what I loved. I've never had that kind of existence but people are perfectly, you do whatever you like. But for me, that was how I've lived my life. And so that's what appealed to me. And that's why he was able to draw me into an intimate relationship. So there was like triple elements with him as to the lies, meaning that we couldn't make genuine consent. And then within consent legislation, there's actually two parts to it. There's person A and person B. So it says person A must be able to make informed consent or be able to consent. That can be negated by being overly drunk, by being drugged, by clearly saying no. That's the kind of thing, being under 16. But by the time you're 15 years, 364 days old, the next day you're not covered by grooming legislation, at that young age. But then there's part B, where person B must believe that person A consented. And this for me is where it really drops down, because he knew full well that through the grooming process that none of us would have consented if we knew the reality of his life. And indeed, if he'd have turned up at my front door and said to me that night, I've got something I need to tell you. My name isn't really Anthony Ray. I'm actually married. And everything that I've told you for the last 3 months about what I want for a relationship with you was a lie. I actually just want to have an open relationship with as many people as I can, and it won't lead anywhere. He would never have come in my house. End of. And he knew that. That's why the lie continued throughout the whole time that I knew him, because he knew the second he told me the truth, that would have been it. So for me, consent could not have been real in that respect, and it needs to change.
And are you getting somewhere? Is this message resonating? Or is it, I mean, I'm assuming as ever with these things, when we look at trying to change fundamentals of the law, it's always, part of me thinks we shouldn't be able to change law easily because law is significant and it matters. But equally, when we look at something like this, what you're up against is, I can see lots of technical arguments that, you've made them yourself. You've sort of said, well, maybe there's this reason, there's that. You can sort of see whether, so it's going to be challenging and difficult. Are you making headway? This seems to me, this is really hard to get through. On the face of it, people recognize what you're talking about, but this is going to be quite challenging, right?
Yeah, there has now been some really significant research done, and it came out, I think it's either Jan 22 or Jan 23 by some universities and professors up in the Midlands. I have got a link to it, but I can't remember their names at this point. But they have suggested that the law needs reforming now around this, because with the inception of social media and dating apps, which hold absolutely no regulation whatsoever, it has literally opened the floodgates for predators like him. Remember, this wasn't a one-off case. This is predatory, ongoing behaviour, which is why my case is quite excessive in that respect. There are so many of us to show that predatory, repetitive behaviour. It's literally opened a front door to a sweet shop of people that they can target and use it as a hunting ground, rather than the off chance, opportune time of maybe bumping into a woman in a pub on a Friday night, that there might be the opportunity to talk into doing something and lying about it. This is like handing them 10,000 people on a plate. And because of that, it's become very, very widespread and very extensive. And that's why the laws need changing, because we're not going to go backwards with social media and dating platforms. It's not going to go away. So they need to now move forward with the legal, the legal sphere to match what is happening in the technical world, I think.
And do you feel that the platforms ought to be regulated? Because I can see they'll come up with and say, well, we can't be responsible for how people present themselves. But it seems to me that as ever, that argument falls down. And while they can't stop human intent, there are definitely things they could do.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they should have been regulated from day one, shouldn't they? Let's face it. But as always, it's always after the horse has bolted and we start seeing the problem. So whatever the fraud is, and we know that in the fraud sphere that I work in now, it's something like 80% of financial fraud is initiated through the platforms, whether it's social media or dating platform. I think Meta is one of the worst. Like Facebook Marketplace is it's the biggest percentage of where frauds are committed. So there absolutely needs to be regulation, but taking away the money side of it, dating apps are an absolute predator's dream. And if there was verification on these platforms, and I mean real verification, and by that, I don't mean that everybody needs to have their name, age, address plastered all over their platform for their profile for everyone to see. But behind that profile, there has to be the accessibility easily for that platform and for law enforcement, that when something does go wrong, that person is then removed and never allowed on there again. And that way, at least, even if there's not a conviction that goes place with the sexual abuse and the sexual presentation that goes on, at least the police, if they've got lots of evidence that prove that that person has, even if it won't reach CPS impossible thresholds, that there is enough evidence to be seen that that has happened, that then platforms have got some way to log these to not let those people on there again, so that behaviour can't be repeated. There's got to be something. They're making billions a year,
Yeah, and it seems to me this ability to hide is absolutely critical because that's what allows you to continue. If there was a risk of being exposed, you wouldn't dare try it along the same way. And I think it's testament to the effort that you put in that demonstrates how easy it is to hide.
Yeah, it is. It is. So it's just vital that I think now it would also impact so many other things. I mean, we look at knife crime, we look at youth knife crime. They can only get hold of those knives because it's so easy to purchase them online. They couldn't walk into a shop and do it, but they can order because there's no age verification. Even on like Sainsbury's, for example, that sell all of the knives, and that someone can just lie setting up a profile on there to be able to purchase anything they want. So if we get a kind of verification, I've talked with like my MP and some other specialists about we called it like an online passport. So I don't think it's right that people should send in driving licenses and passports as verification to separate platforms, because we all know that these platforms aren't necessarily brilliant at data protection. And if your information is out there and it's going to get lost or sold, no thanks. Like LinkedIn keeps saying to me about verifying, well, you're not having my passport. No, you're not. So no, I won't. But I do think, in the UK, for example, with DBS checks, it's a range of different documents that verify you for that kind of thing. So why can't we have a system where we're using those kind of things to present us with a biometric, for example, that has our validity as a human being, and then it's that biometric that is used to sign into or set up and register on a platform. That way, we ensure that people are only having one profile per person, because if your biometric's already been used, you can't set up another one. But it also safeguards us as humans to not have our information, stolen by platforms that aren't regulating their GDPR stuff properly and things like that.
What can people do to help support your campaign? Because I'm really struck by you've put a lot into this personally. And I mean both personal emotion, but the effort, the work that you do now. What can people do to support you?
I think for me, the most important thing is that we talk about it. And that's why I'm always willing to come on and do podcasts or whatever, because it's only telling our stories when people then start recognizing it. So, for example, one that I'll pull out I've done quite recently was with Annie McManus on her Changes podcast. And I went on there and loads of victims, so many contacted me after I did that. And even though their frauds were the online financial romance fraud, they listened to me discussing how he went about manipulating me and the stories that he told. And they absolutely recognised all of that from their story. And I know that supported them, but then it also creates courage for others to talk out about it. And it's only when we can stop the stigma around this particular kind of thing, because I got trolled relentlessly online, even though there wasn't money involved with mine. Cecilia got trolled relentlessly. Those girls were all called stupid, naive gold diggers. And then the people where it's all online, they get trolled. A common thing that you see in the comments, oh, is there any room left in the loony bin for these idiots and stuff like that? Because people are so uneducated about how clever and subtle this manipulation is that takes place before any of that happens. They also tend to forget that everyone's a unique human being, and that the way we react in life in general is due to our makeup, our genetics, our DNA, our education, our culture, our upbringing. our past life experiences. So all of those things absolutely create the person we are and how we will react in a fraud, as well as how we will react coming out of it. So it's just really important that we have more understanding, more education, that people stop victim blaming so that others are more willing to come forward. I think there's a statistic of 1 in 3 people have either been a victim of this kind of fraud, an emotional fraud, or they know someone who has. Absolutely, we were saying those people that will stand there and go, well, that will never happen to me. They are most likely the people that a kind of fraud will happen to, because they don't have that suspicion, that naturally suspicious, thinking about them, because they just believe that they're clever enough not to get exploited by it. But the likelihood is that they will, whether it's that kind of fraud or a different one. So we need to stop the stigma around it. We actually need to change that language of fall for. We need to say victims are targeted and exploited by, rather than they fall for, because that kind of puts the blame on the victim again. You fell for it. It's kind of that blaming language, isn't it? We don't say people fell for a burglary. We don't say they fell for a car theft, but it's all theft into the chain.
And I think what's really interesting when you talk about it is that the techniques that are deployed, as you say in your context, which was not a pleasant experience by any stretch of the imagination. You might not have directly lost money, but you certainly lost time and felt understandably vulnerable. But it's the same techniques that can be deployed across the pieces. And so what I think is really interesting about this is that we should absolutely deal with the thing you're talking about. The experience you had is not something anybody should have to go through. But if we solve for that, we also help to solve for a range of other things. So I guess what I've taken away from this whole piece is, even if you don't think you're susceptible to this, and I would suggest that we all are on some level if we're in the position where we're looking for a relationship, this will help solve a whole load of other things as well, right? If we got in place the protections you're talking about, and we didn't just look at dating sites, we looked at other platforms where similar sorts of communication can happen, you're solving a much bigger societal problem.
Huge, absolutely. And it is, there's always overlaps wherever we go. Nothing is in its little box. And every single little thing that we do has an overlap into something else. I think we're way past the time that verification needs to happen, proper verification. And I'm not just talking about Elon Musk's pay me £8 a month to have a blue tick so that your tweets get seen, or that you can edit what you've made a mistake in. And it shouldn't be on Facebook, pay me £8 a month so that you can have a blue tick. And that means that you can actually talk to someone on this platform when something seems a little bit wrong. It needs to be that it's just standard across the board. And then it, like we say, it solves a whole range of problems. I bet you our fraud levels would plummet. Our predatory sexual abuse and everything else that goes on online would plummet. Our paedophilia, who are our classic catfish online with men or women setting up profiles as teenagers to groom and abuse our kids, it would vanish, because they haven't got the facility to enable them to do it anymore, not on the scale that they're doing it now. So it is time that it was put in place. And I would argue that anyone that's got a problem with that, it says more about them than the people that want it.
I think that's a fantastic note, Ed, but I can't let you go, Anna, without getting some tips for people who might find themselves. And I guess let's take it more broadly, because I think the things that you might use to identify the sort of situation you were in and could, as we've said, apply to other things. But what are the sorts of things people should be looking out for?
So I would say, it's very, very easy to give people a checklist of things to look for on profiles, particularly. And there are some really blinding things, but it's a long list of things. And they are updating those all the time when they become aware that, that's becoming very obvious now, we'll change it to something else. But the one thing that doesn't change is that feeling you get in this kind of situation. So I often try and describe it so that people get an understanding of a normal relationship. A healthy relationship is like a normal coffee, just having a latte. These kinds of relationships, whether it's the natural behaviors of a narcissist or a psychopath or a predator, or whether it's an online romance fraudster, it's like having a double shot of espresso. The intensity and the feeling that you get from that relationship is very different. And if you feel at all overwhelmed, because it's a nice overwhelming feeling, but if you feel at all overwhelmed in that first few weeks of a relationship and it's all moving very, very fast and it feels like that soulmate connection, that's a really huge sign that this is the start of something wrong, whether it's an online romance fraudster or whether it's a predator like mine, or if it's going to be a toxic relationship. They all start in that same fashion. You get that overwhelming, intense feeling. So I would say if you get any hint of that, you need to listen to those vibes that are inside you. Just take a step back and talk to someone about it. Get them to go through things with you. And it might be then that with that fresh pair of eyes, away from that emotional, rush that you get, that someone else can say, actually, things don't look quite right there. And that reminds me of. So it's allowing yourself to take a step back and talk to someone else about what's going on. And that's when you'll start recognizing things, because it doesn't take long to get drawn in. And then all of those little things that might be really obvious to people on the outside, they're gone. Our biology, the chemicals in our brain, they've all already set in and you're not going to see it. You need to be able to take a step back and get someone else to come in and have a look with you.
Wow. We haven't even talked about what technology is going to do to this. AI is going to make this situation even more complicated. But I think I've taken more than enough of your time. We've got more than enough for things for people to think about. I want to say thank you for being so open about what happened to you. Thank you for being courageous and fighting it, because I know that what you experienced came at a personal cost, but I know that the time, the effort, and the emotional investment that you've made in what you do now also continues to come at great cost. And I think that's never to be underestimated. What you're doing requires courage and bravery. And I think society is better as a result of people like you stepping up to be counted for these things. So thank you for that. But above all, thank you for just being an absolutely incredible guest on the show. It's been one of those shows where I've not really had to say anything because you've done all the talking, which is exactly the way it should be. I'll put links to your website and resources that people can find if they're interested in finding out more to support you, but also if they think they may be in a position where this is there. So that'll be all in the show notes for people. But I just want to say thank you so much. It's been difficult to listen to in parts, but I think those often make the best episodes. Thank you so much for coming to the show and just providing an incredible set of experiences and for us to learn from.
Oh, thank you so much for having me as always, and hope to see you again soon for some other bits and pieces.
Look forward to that. Thank you.
Take care, Christian. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Anna for appearing. To find out more about Anna, her work with Catch the Catfish and Love Said, and the campaign for legal reform around romance fraud, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, thanks for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you enjoyed the episode, please do leave a review wherever you get the show. It helps others to find the show and allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests. To discover episodes that you might have missed, visit the show's website, humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. If you're using online dating apps, do take a moment to pause and reflect on whether things feel a little bit too good to be true. You never know. And thank you so much for listening.